All right, we're going to start talking about prophets tonight, and we'll start just thinking about what is involved in prophecy and being a prophet. We're going to talk about some of the early prophets tonight. We'll talk a little bit about Elijah and Amos and Micah, and then we'll kind of move forward in time over our next two sessions. These are three of some of the earlier prophets that are mentioned in the Bible, either through stories like with Elijah or their own books like Amos and Micah. And they are all in around the 8th century BC to help you kind of locate where they are on the timeline. First, let's think about what prophecy might mean, just to get our brains started. What would you say is a definition of prophecy? What things are included in it? Shout them out, I'll write them down.
Prediction of the future.
Okay, future predictions, okay.
Preacher.
What's that?
Preacher.
Preaching, yeah, preacher, yep. Yep.
Spoken to by God.
That's right. Spoken to by God. They get their message from the Lord, yeah. And then they deliver it. Sometimes write it down, sometimes preach it out loud, sometimes sort of a one-on-one delivery. Yep. Anything else? Other stuff? We'll come back to it later if there's anything that we forgot. Okay, that's a good start. So Elijah, Amos, and Micah, like I said, they were in the 8th century BC, and that's during the larger time of the kings, but it's in the period of the divided kingdom. And we've kind of hinted at this summary over the past few weeks. When the Israelites got to the land of Canaan, they were led by different judges that we've talked about. Gideon was one we've talked about. Joshua was kind of the first one. Samson we talked about. And after a while, the Israelites looked at all the neighboring peoples that were kind of threats to them, and they felt like the neighboring peoples had a leg up because the neighbors had kings to lead them. So the Israelites said, we want a strong king who can make our nation great, and we'll be stronger and a threat to our neighbors, and so that we can really establish ourselves. And God said, you don't need that. I'm going to take care of you. And the people said, we don't care. We want a strong king so we can feel safer and he can lead us to victory. So God said, okay, that's what you want. And they got King Saul, was the first king of all of Israel, and he was quite arrogant, made bad decisions, so full of himself that he would be paranoid towards any kind of assumed threats to his authority, like young David, who started coming along the scene. And eventually, Saul died kind of by his own bad choices and mistakes in battle. But then, fortunately, King David took over, and that was Israel's kind of golden period, where they were the largest and the biggest that they had ever been. After David was his son Solomon as king. And then after Solomon, even though Solomon had great wisdom and helped build the temple, after Solomon died, there was a civil war in Israel, and it kind of split between a north and a south. And the northern part became its own kingdom and just kept the name Israel. And the southern part became its own kingdom and went by the name Judah because of the different tribes that were in that kingdom. Judah was the strongest tribe. So for the next 400 years or so, it was a divided kingdom. And when you read some of the chapters in like the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, it'll kind of go back and forth. And it'll say, so-and-so is the king of Israel. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So-and-so is the king of Judah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So-and-so is the king, he reigned for 10 years. He reigned for 5 years. And it kind of will jump back and forth. So I want to give you a little more detailed timeline as a reference. There's lots of details in here, so feel free to not look at it tonight, but just as a reference of all the major hit points in the divided kingdom, and then in the exile, and then when they come back from exile. So I tried to include all the important stuff for about 500 years. So I'm going to give this as a reference. And feel free to read it or not, or just kind of keep it in your Bible as helpful information. And during this period, prophets had a hard job because all the kings weren't doing so well. So there was a lot that the prophets had to speak to. And that's what we will be reading and talking about tonight. And we'll see that it's hard out there for a prophet, especially when your country's not acting so great and your king is not acting very great either. So, what I want us to do, I'm going to divide us up into 3 groups so we can learn about 3 prophets at a time, and then we will get back together. So I think I'll do, like, this side is going to be one group, this side's another group, and then the back will be a 3rd group. So does anybody have any prophet requests that they would like to study a little bit about that one, or shall I just assign the groups randomly? Anybody has any favorites or ones that they're extra interested in? Speak now. Go. Okay. All right, so group.
Chris's favorite is Elijah.
Oh, no. Makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. Then you all are group 1. So you're going to be reading some stories about Elijah. So if you could just hand those out to your other group 1 members. We'll do group 2 over here. You're going to be looking at some chapters in Amos. And then folks in the back, you are group 3. And you're going to be looking at some passages in Micah. But if you want to jot down some answers, you can, if that helps you remember. And after a few minutes, after you've kind of read through them, then we'll reconvene. So I'll go pause the video while we read and think. Okay, so Elijah, the 2 stories, he's trash talking King Ahab, who has given into the temptation of worshiping other gods, and even Ahab kind of empowered the prophets of those other gods. So what are some of the messages and predictions that Elijah delivers?
Well, in the first story, the prediction was that the God that he followed was more powerful than the God of Baal.
Yeah.
And so that whole demonstration proved that out.
Yeah.
And that was, so that came true very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
In the second story, Ahab was told that, all these terrible things were going to happen to Jezebel, to him, and all, if he didn't change his ways, which Ahab tried to do. I mean, he repented and got in sackcloth and all that, and all he did was just delay the consequences of his actions 1 generation.
Yeah.
So basically that was a generational delay.
Yeah.
On the predictions.
Yeah. So some of the consequences and the predictions were kind of immediate. Some would have been like maybe a few years, maybe 10 years down the line. Okay, and the last question for group 1, the stories in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings continue telling the story of the kings for another 300 years. So the books weren't finished until after the terrible, traumatic defeat of the exile and after the people had come back. So group 1, what message do you think the people who read this after the exile got from these stories?
No more kings. We're done.
they're finished with kings. They didn't serve us well the last time.
No,
Uh-huh.
yeah, didn't work out so well.
Yeah. Which is a fair message, don't put your trust in kings and princes,
And whenever you turn away from God, bad things happen.
Yeah. And so if the people who had just experienced the baddest bad things that they could ever remember, reading a story with that message kind of gives them a framework to understand what happened to them. Because they wouldn't have had like a public school where every kid is taught all the history of, local history, national history. Here's what happened and here's the test. They might not have had all the information about what led up to them being exiled. I don't think there was a newspaper, like in the Babylonian Times or something, that they could help understand what was going on. They just knew that it was awful. And so reading stories like this after they got back would help them give some understanding and say, okay, that's kind of the bad choices, like the selfish decisions and the consequences that led up to the terrible thing that happened to us. Let's not make similar mistakes in the future. Let's stick with God. Let's follow the Lord and what God wants for our lives, so that we don't go as off track again. Yeah. Well, good. Thank you, Group 1. What about Group 2? So they had the prophet Amos, and they had some verses in 4 different chapters of Amos. So Group 2, what was Amos's message for his people at the time? What was the prophet or God upset about, and what did he prophesy? You can shout out, different people shout out.
Well, Israel had slipped into having monuments built to other kings, other gods on Israel land, and people worshiped that strictly against everything that had been taught. They still did it, and he was just letting them know that you can't do things without consequences. The consequences are coming, and you're bringing them on yourself. But they surely wouldn't listen to them.
What, any kind of examples about kind of consequences that they might have gotten? And how was it received? Was Amos's message welcomed? And everyone said, "Oh, thank you for letting us know. Thank you for that heads up."
No, they had misquoted you. They went to the king and said Amos is plotting against you. He's talking about all this bad things going to happen because of you. And deliberately said against Amos, even though he has not said that at all.
So they accuse Amos of some trash talking, some rebellious messages against the king and the land. Which did not go over well. All right. So Group 2 and 3, you each had a creative assignment to compose a prophecy to the modern church by kind of rephrasing and rewriting some of your verses using more modern imagery and language. What did you come up with for a modern paraphrasing of Amos chapter 5? Lay it on us. We're ready. We won't get upset. Okay, well, okay, now our expectations are rising for Group 3. Anybody come up with a good one, or summary kind of, or just kind of general?
Just, almost like I've been telling you all along, and you're still not listening. And now I'm gonna do this to you. It really seems like our country is divided and as angry as it is right now, that perhaps we are being set up, we are setting ourselves up for a big fall.
Yeah, maybe we are enduring some consequences of our own behaviors and all the turmoil that we're going through right now.
And
Yep.
hopefully,
The last few years.
hopefully the churches and the faithful, you know, are holding that on.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
By those believers that are still faithful.
yes, to seek peace and pursue it, as the Psalms say. Yeah, well, good, thank you, group 2. All right, group 3, you all had some verses in 3 chapters of the book of Micah. So group 3, what was Micah's message for his people? What was he or God upset about? And what were some of the consequences he prophesied?
He agreed with everything Amos said.
Okay, So how did you know? Like, for example, what?
I read it in the.
It said so, right?
Yeah. And he stands for justice.
I guess there must have been, go ahead.
In addition, he was not of the elite descent. He came from a common.
So he wasn't part of like the wealthy and the ruling class. Mhm. And if he was if he was preaching, we need more justice in the land, that kind of implies there was a lot of injustice that was going on in the land. All right, group 3, table 2, what do you all think about Amos's message and what he and the Lord?
He said that, you need to listen because the Lord is coming, and if you don't listen, he will make a heap of rubble out of Samaria, and that, all her idols will be broken, that you should know how to worship, but not to worship idols. I'm assuming that's.
Pure worship.
What would pure worship be or look like?
Doing away with those idols, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And focusing on the Word of God.
Was that the one, or was it in Amos where he said, let justice roll on like an ever-flowing stream?
I think it was Amos,
Was it
because
Amos?
I don't remember reading it.
I think you're right, I think that was Amos.
5:24.
Yeah, which shows that, like Joe said, Micah and Amos seem to be on the same page in the message that God was giving them and the problems that they saw in their society, in their countries, and with the leadership, how there was injustice going on, there was mistreatment going on, and they were prophesying / preaching against the people's behavior. I can see two tracks of behavior that they're preaching against and saying, you need to stop that, there'll be consequences. There's the religious behavior, because the people and the kings, the leaders, had turned away religiously from true, authentic worship of the Lord, and therefore their behavior out in the public sphere was one of injustice and mistreatment and cheating others, exploiting and oppressive, we can assume. So there's kind of the two tracks that the prophets are talking about. Like, your behavior with other people out in the world is bad and wrong and unjust. Also, your relationship with God, you have ignored and you've gotten off track. And we talked about that a little bit when we kind of talked about how the book of Deuteronomy kind of laid a foundation for how all the other books and the people in those later books should act. and how there was such a tight connection between your relationship with God and how that affects the way you treat other people. And the prophets are saying, you got both those wrong. You're doing both those wrong, and there'll be serious consequences coming down the pike if you don't stop.
Well, these, consequences, Jerusalem and the fall, that he was speaking of.
Yep. And it's kind of interesting, that's why I asked the Elijah group, what was the timeline, like how long before those predictions would take place? One was like the same day, another one was like 10 years later, and in the case of Amos and Isaac, it would have been like 300 years later. And if you look on the timeline, kind of near the bottom, like 721, the destruction and exile of the northern kingdom is complete. So the prophets who were prophesying in the northern kingdom of Israel, that's when the consequences exploded and came to a head. And the southern kingdom gets completely annihilated and exiled in about the year by 587. It kind of goes on, they're attacked, they're conquered, some are exiled, more are exiled, but by 587 it's done, and they're just done as a nation state and as a society. They were totally, almost totally annihilated. So yeah, those were the big consequences coming down that ended up being a few hundred years later. And I wonder if that's why it was kind of hard for the people or the kings to receive when consequences are kind of vague, like you better shape up or you're really gonna suffer, mister. That maybe they just didn't believe it, and things were going so well in their idol worshiping. They were being selfish, they were indulging, they were taking advantage of other people, and they thought, this is all right. Why change this crazy prophet guy who's trash talking? We don't need to listen to him. What does he know? He says he speaks for the Lord. If I can find this other prophet, he says he speaks for the Lord. He tells me everything I want to hear. I'm going to hire this guy. Forget Amos, forget Micah. I don't like what he's saying. This guy says he speaks for the Lord. I like his message. Come on, you're in, buddy. You're in the kingdom now. Yeah. So now that we've read some samples of what different prophets did and said and wrote, is there anything that we want to add to our list of what is considered to be prophecy in the Bible and what prophets do in the Bible? Anything else that we want to add to kind of get a big, full understanding of prophecy and prophets?
Now, I have a question.
Yeah, question.
Is this deep for anybody else, or is this just me?
It's a lot of material,
Yes.
and we really haven't, like, good students, and we haven't really gotten into specific and then being able to express what we thought.
Yeah, I can't speak for everyone, Kathy. It's deep for me. Okay.
It's very deep.
I agree, you're a hard teacher.
Yeah, it is, it's, I was trying to write even a prophecy for today.
Oh, yeah, I forgot to ask it. Yeah.
From, and I was thinking, it reads, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of Israel, who despise justice. Well, I was thinking about today, and something on the side of what Paul said. Our leaders take bribes, they work and teach only for the money that they can bring to themselves. And they tell us fortunes for money. God does not support any of that. And our country will become a heap of rubble if we continue on this course. So I have written a prophecy for.
That's really well done, Kathy. You were right. That was really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She had it good.
Don't change.
Yeah.
It's just like, I've been going to church all my life, and there's still so much I don't know. And when I've gotten into conversations with other friends that don't go to church, and when we've gotten into conversations about the Bible, I mean, there's been times that I can't answer things.
Sure.
And I feel bad about it, but
We
this is,
can't know everything.
you know,
Kathy.
I just wondered if this was deep for anybody except me. I guess I feel better now, that I don't feel bad. I guess that's all.
So you don't feel bad. They asked St. Paul the very same question. Very same thing. How do we notice that? And he said, you see through a glass dimly, and you can see in part the knowing part. But the time will come when the glass will be clear, and you will see it. But we were taught in bits and pieces, and some you hold on to and some you don't. But we're talking about history, which is hard on anybody, and religion, which is hard on anybody. And you put those two together and try to come up with who we are. And you really can get on some slippery slopes, you know. And, yeah, today, the things we do now, if we looked at history, the Roman Empire fell because it turned itself, everything to the theaters, watching the gladiators, all this stuff. What do we do with our young men, putting on uniforms, going on field, kicking the ball place to place? You know, same thing, same thing.
Hopefully not killing
Yeah.
Say what, Kathy?
each other. Hopefully not killing each
At
other.
least they have to have a
Yeah.
stopping point, don't they?
Yeah,
But there's still, it's the same principle, is watching people struggle against each other for some objective. Just, like St. Paul said, you'll see as through a glass dimly. But it's like reaching out into the dark. The more you reach out there, the more you realize it's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with, as I see the Bible's wisdom being infinite, then the more deeper you get in, the more you realize this goes on forever. You know what I mean? And to the point about, like when questions are asked and you go, gosh, I don't know. When I'm talking to kids, whether it's my kids or kids in the church, and I love getting them engaged about faith and the Bible and God and what it means. And man, just last night, Silas was bringing out all the questions. Just, bedtime, they want to put that off. They know what can get me going and interested. So Silas was asking like, well, what is God really? And where did God come from? And in creation, in history, So yeah, kids are going to ask great questions, and I tell them, sometimes you're going to ask a question that is so great, I don't know the answer to it. But we will think about it together, and we'll ask it together. And that's where the blessings come. Because I don't know all the answers. I've not been to heaven, and I don't have God's infinite perspective. None of us do, because all of us only have finite perspectives. And we're going through, the Old Testament covers a span of stories, like 1,500 years, 2,000 years. And like I said last week, we've been kind of going like just kind of a steam train, just kind of washing, just kind of pushing right through, because there's so much, we could read the Old Testament, forever, for years. So I've been kind of taking these wide arcs. And if we ever get kind of too wide and you go, you lost me. I don't know where the arc connects anymore. Pause. Like, where are we in this kind of overview arc that we're going on? Then just say, pause. Where are we right now? What's going on right now? And that'll be a good reminder. Okay, here's where we are. And that's why I'm giving the overview, so that when you go back and you read some of those stories, you can go, oh, I can see this is a prophet. It says he's prophesying in Judah to this guy who was the king of Judah at the time. And you can kind of go back and kind of look at the timelines and go, oh, okay, I remember we talked about what was going on. Now that gives me a little more context, so that these verses aren't just, sometimes we'll read, like in worship, we'll do an Old Testament reading and we'll read kind of 6 verses, and just kind of hold them out as really good verses and a really good message. And it's a great idea for us to remember. But when we just kind of pluck them out and just kind of read a little passage, then we forget all the things that was going on around it in Amos's life, in the king that was getting mad at him, and what his people were doing that motivated him, and God's message to be delivered. So there's just all this kind of big context, which is very, very deep, very, very deep. So yeah, if we ever get too far disconnected in our art, just kind of raise a hand and say, where are we again? And we'll figure it out. Yeah, right.
Well, I was gonna say the same thing you were saying, that, and we've studied the Bible, and you flip one page from Malachi, and all of a sudden 300 years ago.
Sure.
And you're in a completely different situation,
Yeah.
completely different government,
Yeah.
completely different everything.
Yeah.
One page.
Yeah. Yeah. And since the Old Testament books, they're not all kind of in chronological order, it's hard to get a feel for what the movement of the story of the people of Israel is, and what God was doing through them or trying to do in spite of themselves. So that's why I'm trying to keep in mind the big story, and kind of hitting some of the books that the books that are kind of mile markers in that story. Now that we've heard some prophetic messages, is there anything we want to add to our understanding of what prophecy is, what prophets do and say?
Well, we may want to modify that future predictions, and you may want to just amplify a little bit, so they could be immediate, they could be centuries, and maybe you could even say some of them are very specific, and some of them are a bit obscure.
And like you said, we might kind of want to put like an asterisk, here on future predictions, because it's not so much a definitive prediction, it's more like a heads up warning. If you keep doing this, then this will happen. So that's kind of the prediction, but that means it's not a certainty. Like, there's always a chance for you to repent, people. You can change your ways, O king. You can stop, being selfish. You can follow the Lord now, and it'll get better. So yeah, kind of future in quotes and predictions in quotes, more like warnings.
And all the prophets seem at their core, they speak the truth, even if it is not wanting to be heard.
Yeah.
That's true, that is so true,
Speak the hard truth.
that is so true.
That's why next time when we come back, we'll start reading Jeremiah, and he must have known that, because Jeremiah was like, "Don't ask me to be a prophet. I don't want to do that. That's a terrible job. That would be awful. Please don't ask me to be a prophet." Oh, and he lamented his whole kind of prophetic career, just kind of wallowing. It's just really, really hard, because being a prophet's really hard. All right, and I'm going to add not just kind of future, but also current like social commentary on how people are acting now, what it means, what's bad, what's wrong. So it's tough being a prophet, as we can see, and we'll keep talking about that when we read some other prophets. And in the ones that Elijah was involved in and Amos was involved in, they both mentioned the specific king that was in power at the time. It was King Ahab that Elijah was under, and it was King Jeroboam that Amos was under. And both of those kings, like we said, saw these prophets as troublemakers. They didn't like the prophets. They felt that Amos and Elijah were being unsupportive, overly critical of their king and country. Therefore, they were being unpatriotic because they questioned what the king was doing and what the country was doing. So, do you think the prophets were troublemakers? Would you kind of call them troublemakers?
Not all of them.
No, they're more like truth tellers, and sometimes the truth is hard to receive.
Depends on who the audience was.
Yes, yes. And you said a few minutes ago, Joe, some things never change. Like, it's kind of amazing but a little sad to see that humans still have the same temptations towards corruption, selfishness, arrogance, indulgence. And depending on who the audience is, you can watch the news for a few decades and see this pattern emerge. That if there's a group that doesn't like who is in power at the time, then they think that criticizing the person in power is a patriotic thing to do. But then as the years go by, if they or their group gets in power, then they think that anyone who criticizes and questions them is unpatriotic. So it just kind of depends, like Joe said, depends on who the audience is. If the audience feels like you're being critical of them, they don't like you. And that's what the prophets faced. And the kings that the prophets were criticizing would either try and kill the prophets, shun the prophets, or find some other prophet that would give a message they liked better. So, a lot of downsides to being a prophet. Anybody want to be a prophet today? Anybody?
I have one comment. This may be getting ahead of yourself, but if you look at, you're going to talk about Jeremiah, and if you look at Jonah, and Jonah goes, resisted like heck, goes in and speaks a 16-word sermon, converts 2 million people immediately, right?
Yeah.
And Jeremiah spent 40 years banging his head against the wall and converted no one.
Yeah.
No one.
And watch his people suffer the consequences.
So a prophecy is not just a single event. I mean, it's going to be a lifetime
Yeah.
event.
Yeah.
With some of the larger books.
Yeah.
It's just kind of, it's all over the map.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. The time involved can be different for prophets, but what's always the same is that they're speaking a message that God has given them, even if it's a hard truth about how people are acting right then. And they might mention a consequence now or in the future. So, Pat gave a good modern day prophecy to keep in mind, and Joe reminded us that humans are still humans, just like humans were humans 3,000 years ago. So we still need some prophetic messages. We don't have to be professional full-time prophets that everyone gets upset at because they feel you're being overly critical. But we can speak a message that God has laid on our hearts when we feel that people are being mistreated, or there's corruption around, or there is injustice, and God is wanting the people to turn their hearts towards holiness, towards righteousness, and to act accordingly. Then we can kind of be inspired by these prophets who did the lifetime hard work, and maybe just kind of be inspired to encourage and have a little bit of a little prophetic note to our voice, because we want to help people improve, our loved ones improve, our society improve, our country improve, its leaders improve. That's our goal. We don't have to be jerks about it. We can always seek peace and pursue it. Like Paul was saying, just all the turmoil and divisions don't seem to be helping anybody, but we can speak out of love to help build up strength and justice. And you don't have to be a jerk to do that. You can be a loving person to do that. So we can, maybe we can reframe what it might sound like or include to be a little bit of a prophet today. So that's what I want you to kind of be thinking about. What would it sound like or look like for someone to have a prophetic voice today, and how can you incorporate that into things that you say and you communicate? All right, we will stop there, and we will pick up with some more prophets next time, but not next Wednesday. We're off next Wednesday. So go in peace to love and serve the Lord.